In just 3 seconds, one wrong decision can change a lifetime. In the courtroom, Officer Jake mocked an elderly woman, unaware that she was someone with unimaginable power. When the truth is revealed, everything he thought he knew about respect and authority will be turned upside down. Will Jake realize his mistake before it's too late? Get ready for a shocking and emotional story you won't want to miss. Jake drove the police car slowly through the courthouse area, his eyes constantly scanning the hurried pedestrians and the busy traffic weaving through the crowded street. But something caught his attention, forcing him to focus. An elderly woman dressed in a faded floral dress walked slowly along the sidewalk, each step deliberate but seemingly tiring. Her silver hair couldn't shield her from the harsh sunlight, and she appeared in no rush. She simply walked one step at a time, unbothered by the noise of the world around her. But to Jake, the old woman was an obstacle he couldn't tolerate. He inhaled deeply, feeling irritation rise within him. This old lady, slow as a tortoise. He muttered to himself, loud enough for his colleague Eleanor to hear. Eleanor just sighed, glancing at her but saying nothing. Jake looked at the woman with a sneer, his contempt evident in the expression on his face. He couldn't stand the sight of an old woman slowing everything down around him. "Come on, old lady. Hurry up. I've got things to do," Jake yelled, his voice dripping with mockery and disdain. He stepped out of the police car arrogantly, his boots hitting the ground with a force that seemed meant to dominate everyone around him. Despite feeling deeply insulted, Mrs. Amara remained silent. Her gaze was calm. Her eyes, aged but sharp, met Jake's with quiet intensity. She didn't utter a word, simply continuing to walk at her own pace without any hint of urgency. But that calmness, to Jake, was unacceptable. He had no idea that Mrs. Amara wasn't just an ordinary person. "Look at her," Jake continued to mock. "Seems like she's never heard of the word hurry." He intentionally stood close to Mrs. Amara, looking her up and down as though she was an insignificant object, just another nameless face in the crowd. He tugged the brim of his police hat down, making an exaggerated gesture as though he were scrutinizing an obstruction in his path. "Old lady, please hurry up," Jake continued to jeer. "Blocking traffic in the middle of downtown is probably not your job." He laughed loudly, a self-satisfied, condescending laugh, but he didn't realize that every word he spoke was stripping away his own dignity. He paused for a moment, staring directly at Mrs. Amara, then added, "Is this how you live your life, walking this slowly? Don't you ever think about doing things faster, old woman?" Jake could feel the tension in the air, but he assumed that Mrs. Amara wouldn't dare to respond. The feeling of being in control only made him more arrogant. He didn't even notice that there was another set of eyes watching his every move, eyes that weren't filled with anger, but with a terrifying silence. Mrs. Amara stood there without a complaint, just watching him. It was her calmness that unnerved Jake more, because he couldn't understand how someone like her could remain so composed in this situation. She doesn't even know who she's standing in front of, Jake thought. "I'm the cop here, and I have the right to say whatever I want." Jake continued to mock her, but then he turned back to his car, preparing to drive away. But as he was about to get in, he suddenly felt an unexpected discomfort. He didn't understand why, but Mrs. Amara's gaze seemed to linger on him. Jake tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, that she was just another nameless person, insignificant and unimportant. Yet something inside him began to stir, a feeling he couldn't explain. Regardless, he went on with his duties, unaware that the mocking words he had spoken today would have consequences far greater than he could ever imagine. Just an old woman walking slowly in his life. But this woman would become the spark for a change beyond anything he could have foreseen. Jake returned to the police car with a self-satisfied smile, his arrogance growing more apparent by the second. He felt that he didn't need to do anything else, as the old woman had already accepted the ticket without a word of protest. Mrs. Amara's gaze remained unchanged. There was no sign of resistance, no rush, just a calmness so cold it seemed as though she had already witnessed all the injustices of life and had learned to silently endure them. Jake stood there for a long while, watching her, his eyes narrowing as an uncomfortable feeling rose within him. "Why is she so calm?" he thought to himself, as if her silence was a challenge to him. The fact that she didn't respond only made him more angry, but at the same time, it made him more self-assured. He told himself that she must have realized her place in this situation and simply didn't dare to react. This made Jake feel like he was on top of the world, that everything around him was following his rules. He extended his hand to give Mrs. Amara the ticket, not recognizing any respect in his actions, but seeing it only as a part of his duty. "Don't cause any more traffic delays, old lady," Jake said, trying to keep a stern tone in his voice. But despite his words, Mrs. Amara showed no change in her demeanor. Her gaze passed over him, not with anger or frustration, but with an unexplainable calmness that only made Jake feel more unsettled. Mrs. Amara gently took the ticket without saying a word. An oppressive silence filled the air. Jake looked at her again, as if searching for a reaction, an apology, or at least an excuse for her actions. But Mrs. Amara remained silent, accepting the ticket without a single word. That silence was like an invisible challenge to Jake, as if she didn't consider his words to be of any importance. Jake felt abandoned in that moment, as though everything around him had lost meaning. Frustration rose within him. He had expected her to react, to at least defend herself like others did. But no, she chose silence. This made him feel more uncomfortable than ever, as he couldn't control the situation. He had always believed in his own boundless power, but Mrs. Amara's silence showed him a kind of power that he couldn't recognize at that moment. "Who does she think she is?" Jake muttered, confused about why he was so angry. He turned back to the police car and sat in the driver's seat, but an unease lingered in his chest. Despite mocking and ticketing her, Mrs. Amara had never reacted. Her calmness made Jake feel challenged, yet powerless to do anything. The conflict within his mind began to form, as he couldn't understand how she was able to remain so composed. Jake started the car and drove away, but the discomfort didn't fade. He tried to shake off thoughts of Mrs. Amara, but deep down, he knew this was a moment he wouldn't easily forget. Her silence, her calmness, had stirred something inside Jake, a conflict he wasn't prepared for. And now he couldn't stop thinking about her, about how she had made him feel small and ignorant. And so, the journey of change began right here. But at this point, Jake still hadn't realized that it was his mockery that would lead him to changes he had never imagined. The next day, in the busy courthouse, Jake still couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered in his mind from the encounter with Mrs. Amara the day before. He walked into the courthouse, focused on his work as part of his daily routine. Everything around him seemed the same as usual. Lawyers conversing with clients, the accused standing silently while waiting for their trial, and the tense stares of the court staff. But today, something felt different. That feeling, like an indistinct wave, kept creeping into his mind, making it hard for him to focus fully on his tasks. While Jake was performing his duties in the courtroom, he didn't expect Mrs. Amara to show up. She entered the room with a calm and gentle demeanor, as if in no rush. She sat in a corner of the room, her eyes never leaving the ongoing trial. Unlike the others, she wasn't flustered or anxious. She just sat there silently, like a still figure amid the noise and tension of the courtroom. Jake, not recognizing her, continued with his work. However, there was something strange that made him feel uncomfortable. Since the moment Mrs. Amara entered the room, her gaze hadn't left him. The feeling became more intense as time passed, as though she was seeing through every action he made. Even though Jake didn't look directly at her, he could feel her eyes on him, like an invisible pull he couldn't avoid. He tried to ignore her presence, telling himself it was just a coincidence. Yet a part of him couldn't shake the odd sense of unease rising within him. Why was she looking at him for so long? Did she recognize him from yesterday? These questions kept repeating in Jake's mind, though he didn't want to dwell on them. Mrs. Amara remained silent, but her gaze made Jake feel something was off. He didn't realize that in her stare, there was not anger or hatred, but a deep understanding, as if she were observing and evaluating his actions from a distance he couldn't reach. Without a word, her presence made Jake feel like a fish caught on a hook, being dragged into a game he wasn't ready to play. And in that moment, Jake realized that Mrs. Amara was not just an ordinary woman. He couldn't understand why, but there was something about her that made him feel like he was in a situation he couldn't control. These thoughts were quickly pushed aside, as the work at the courthouse still required his attention. However, the strange feeling about Mrs. Amara remained with him, like a gentle ghost clinging to him throughout the trial. Amid the tense atmosphere of the courtroom, everything continued according to the usual routine. Jake and Eleanor, like soldiers patrolling the daily legal battle, kept carrying out their duties. Although Jake no longer thought about Mrs. Amara as much as before, the strange feeling still lingered in his heart, like a faint ghost trailing every step he took. He noticed that Mrs. Amara was still sitting there silently, observing, not in a hurry, and showing no emotions. She didn't utter a single word, simply taking notes in a small notebook. No one in the room seemed to pay attention to her presence, except for the inexplicable feeling Jake couldn't shake. But then, in an unexpected moment, everything changed. Mrs. Amara stood up. Her movement was gentle, but it carried an undeniable authority. It wasn't a rush, nor was it hurried. It was a sudden shift that made every eye in the room turn toward her. Suddenly, the space around her seemed to freeze. All sounds seemed to hush, and the light in the room seemed to focus solely on her. It was only her, with that regal bearing, that made the atmosphere feel suffocating, as if she had become the center of attention that everyone had no choice but to acknowledge. Jake didn't notice, but Eleanor felt a distinct change in the air, something powerful, an undeniable presence that couldn't be ignored. He felt as though he was standing before something far beyond anything he had encountered before. Mrs. Amara didn't speak, but her silence only amplified the power she radiated. The entire room, from those seated outside to the court staff, began to look at her differently, no longer with scrutinizing gazes, but with respect, with a recognition that she was no ordinary person. As Mrs. Amara left the courtroom, Jake paid her no mind. He continued with his work, not thinking for a second about who she might be. But then, suddenly, an FBI agent walked into the room, his demeanor serious but his eyes filled with respect. He walked forward, nodded at everyone in the room, and then pointed toward Mrs. Amara. His voice rang out, formal yet deeply impactful. "Please, everyone, pay attention. This is Director Bernice L. Hathaway, Senior Director of the FBI." The room went silent, and the air grew strangely heavy. The murmurs and whispers from before immediately stopped. All eyes turned toward Mrs. Amara, now the sole figure commanding respect. Jake, along with Eleanor, finally felt the change in the atmosphere. Mrs. Amara, the woman they had encountered that morning, the one Jake had mocked and looked down upon, was now standing before them as a symbol of power and dignity. Jake couldn't believe what he had just heard. His body seemed to freeze. Everything around him grew hazy. The FBI director? She was the one holding the power of such a vast organization? The feeling of being exposed, his arrogance and disdain, now felt like a curtain being pulled away, revealing the embarrassment and unease he couldn't hide. The looks from the lawyers, the accused, and everyone else in the room were now filled with respect and fear. No one dared to mock her anymore. No one dared to treat her as an insignificant person. Mrs. Amara didn't need to say a word. Her presence alone was enough to command the undeniable strength that no one could deny. Jake felt small in that moment. He looked at Mrs. Amara, but he couldn't read anything from her gaze. Despite being a senior FBI director, she still maintained her calm without a hint of arrogance or self-satisfaction, just a natural dignity she had carried through all the years of her work. She didn't need to show her power through words, for her actions and presence spoke volumes. And in that moment, Jake realized that he had been wrong. He had been too self-assured, too arrogant, and he had made a grave mistake in dismissing her. But more importantly, Jake didn't yet know that this encounter would change his life forever. Jake stood there, his eyes still fixed on Mrs. Amara, even though she had returned to her seat. The feeling of change within him had not dissipated. The mocking words he had thrown at her, the disdainful looks, they all swirled in his mind like an unstoppable storm. He couldn't believe that he had treated someone like that, especially someone with the power and dignity that Mrs. Amara possessed. Her gaze, calm and not filled with anger, but with a profound tranquility, echoed in Jake's mind. He felt as though he had seen a part of himself that he had never paid attention to before. A part of him, perhaps one he hadn't even recognized, was full of arrogance and pride. He had thought that just because he was a cop, he could say anything, do anything, without thinking about how he was hurting others. Remembering the words he had spoken that morning, a wave of regret surged through him. The comments he thought were harmless, the jokes he believed were innocent, suddenly became deep cuts in his conscience. "Old lady, hurry up. You've never had to rush in your life, have you?" Those words now echoed in his mind like knives stabbing into his soul. What had he done? At that moment, he had thought he was just doing his job, just a part of the routine. But now he realized that he had abused his power. He had assumed that the title of police officer meant everything, using it to belittle those around him. those he thought were weak or undeserving. Mrs. Amara, with her silence, had made him realize one thing. True power is not something to boast about or impose on others, but something earned through respect and integrity. Jake felt ashamed. He could feel the weight of guilt settling over him. His breath became heavier, his hands fidgeting as if they no longer belonged to him. He turned away, trying to hide the confusion inside, but he couldn't deny that he was facing a mistake he couldn't brush aside. All the images from that morning, from his mocking words to Mrs. Amara's gaze, now converged into one point, trapping him in his own guilt. Did I really mock her like that? Did I hurt someone I knew nothing about? That question kept echoing in Jake's mind, and no answer could ease the guilt that consumed him. Jake began to feel a deep emptiness. He had never thought that a person could wield such power with just a gaze, a silence filled with authority. He had never thought that a small action of his could have such a large impact, not just on someone else, but on himself. Now he understood more clearly the value of respect, and he realized that sometimes even words said in passing could hurt far more than he ever imagined. The feeling of regret engulfed Jake, making him want to disappear from the courtroom immediately. He didn't know what to do to right his wrongs, didn't know how to make amends for what he had done. He only knew that in this moment, he wanted to change. Although the trial had ended and Jake had returned to his daily duties, the image of Mrs. Amara never left his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her sitting silently in the corner of the courtroom, her sharp yet patient gaze vivid and clear in his mind. That feeling, the unshakable calmness she exuded, forced him to confront a truth he hadn't wanted to admit. He had been wrong. He had judged her based solely on appearances, on actions he considered slow and insignificant, not realizing he had hurt someone with power and understanding far beyond anything he could imagine. The shame grew stronger with each passing moment, like a heavy weight pressing down on his heart. Jake began to realize that his arrogance didn't just come from the position he held, but also from the prejudices and lack of understanding he had placed on those around him. He had rushed to judge Mrs. Amara, thinking she was just an old, weak woman unworthy of his attention. But now, everything had changed. He began to understand that it was people like Mrs. Amara who truly held power, not through authority or fame, but through the calm and patience they embodied. Jake couldn't escape the guilt when he thought about how he had behaved. The mocking words, the disdainful gazes, the harsh comments now felt like scars in his mind. He didn't understand why, but it seemed that every time he thought about Mrs. Amara, a wave of shame would hit him, as though she was a mirror reflecting all of his mistakes and shortcomings. The feeling wasn't just about the disrespect he had shown her. It was the realization that he had been too quick to judge others, driven by his own arrogance and inflated ego. Each day that passed, Jake found himself growing more confused and uncomfortable. He couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Amara, about the look of patience and dignity she had given him. Her silence was a lesson in respect, a lesson he had never paid attention to before. Suddenly, the things he once thought were important, the things he believed he had control over, seemed insignificant. Mrs. Amara's presence, the way she made him feel so small, became clearer and clearer in Jake's heart. He wondered, why was I in such a hurry? Why did I judge her based on her appearance without considering that she might have a bigger story, a more important mission than what I could see? This question kept swirling in his mind, and it didn't just make him question Mrs. Amara, but also himself. Jake realized that he needed to change. He couldn't continue living in such arrogance, couldn't continue judging others based on appearances or differences. This was the first time he truly looked at himself, recognizing the flaws in the way he had been living. He felt an anger, not toward Mrs. Amara, but toward himself. Jake had been too quick in his decisions and words, and he knew that now was the time to change, to learn to respect and understand others instead of just seeing them through the lens of outward appearances. It wouldn't be easy, but he understood that only when he could do that would he truly become a better person. A week after the impactful encounter with Mrs. Amara, Jake still couldn't shake the thoughts of her. Despite his attempts to focus on his work, everything seemed to blur when he recalled her silence in the courtroom and the shame he felt each time he thought about what he had done. He was starting to change, but it was a slow, difficult process. Jake felt like he was standing at a major crossroads in his life. Eleanor, Jake's longtime colleague, was the first to notice the change in him. Eleanor was always calm and knew how to remain composed in any situation. Whenever Jake hastily judged someone, Eleanor would be the one to step in, gently reminding him of the values of respect and justice. He knew that Jake wasn't a bad person, but he also saw how arrogance had clouded his judgment in many instances. That day, after a long shift, the two of them sat down for coffee at a cafe near the station. Eleanor looked at Jake intently. "You're different," he said, his voice calm but filled with the sharp observation that few people possessed. Jake didn't look up, only stared into his coffee, trying to keep the feelings of guilt from overwhelming him. Eleanor continued, "You've changed, Jake. Since you met Mrs. Amara, you're not the same." Jake didn't respond immediately. He felt uneasy from Eleanor's words, but then he let out a deep sigh. "You're right, but I still feel unworthy. You know, I mocked her so rudely, and now when I find out she's an FBI director, I just feel like a fool." Jake's voice sounded weary, his eyes empty as he seemed lost in dark thoughts. Eleanor watched Jake for a moment, his eyes full of understanding. "Jake, you can't change everything in one day, but you've realized your mistake, and that's what matters. Everyone makes mistakes, but not everyone has the courage to acknowledge them and change. You don't need to be perfect right away. What's important is that you've realized respect is essential in your job." Eleanor paused, as if searching for the right words to continue. "We're cops, Jake. It's not just about having power in our hands. It's about listening, understanding, and respecting others. In this line of work, respect isn't just for others. It's for yourself too. We can't stand above others to feel powerful. You can change. You just need to be patient with yourself." Jake looked up at Eleanor, a sense of relief washing over him, though it wasn't enough to make him feel completely at peace. "I know, but I still don't feel mature enough to change completely, Eleanor. I've made too many mistakes, too much arrogance in me. I can't keep living like this." Eleanor smiled gently, his eyes full of patience. "That's a big step, Jake. You've become aware, and that's the foundation for your change. No one is perfect, but if you truly want to change, you will. And I believe you'll become someone everyone around you can respect." Jake remained silent, the feelings of regret and the desire to change still lingering in his heart. But something had opened up in his mind. He didn't need to change everything all at once. He just needed to take it step by step, day by day, starting with the smallest actions. Change wasn't a leap. It was a long, challenging journey. "Thank you, Eleanor," Jake said, his voice softer, no longer weighed down by the frustration that had once clung to him. "I'll try." Eleanor patted him gently on the shoulder, smiling lightly. "I know you'll do it. Everyone has a chance to change. The important thing is whether they're willing to walk that path." Jake nodded, for the first time feeling a new spark of hope slowly growing inside him. That day, Jake and Eleanor were called to attend an important meeting about a major case being led by the FBI. The case involved an international criminal network operating right in the heart of the city, and the involvement of the local police was crucial to address the investigation and security concerns. As Jake knew, there would be several important figures from the FBI attending the meeting, all expecting collaboration from the local law enforcement. As Jake walked into the meeting room, he couldn't help but feel a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Even though he had changed a bit after his conversations with Eleanor, he still couldn't shake the guilt that Mrs. Amara had instilled in his heart. He knew she would be present in the meeting, working alongside them, and her presence was never simple. However, he didn't anticipate that this meeting would become a pivotal moment for him. Mrs. Amara, with her usual calm demeanor, entered the meeting room and sat at a position near the head of the table where everyone would have to acknowledge and listen. No one could ignore her, not because she was too conspicuous, but because she had a powerful, silent strength that wasn't easy to recognize at first glance. She didn't need to speak for the room to fall silent. The respect that radiated naturally from those around her was undeniable. As the meeting began, experts from the FBI and other agencies took turns presenting reports, discussing the necessary strategies to approach the criminal network. Jake focused on listening, doing his best to show that he could fulfill his role. However, throughout the meeting, he couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Amara's gaze occasionally rested on him, as though she was evaluating him, seeing through what he was thinking. This made him uncomfortable, but it also made him realize that he needed to be cautious with every word and action. The meeting lasted nearly an hour, and as everyone was preparing to wrap up, Mrs. Amara spoke. Her voice wasn't loud nor forceful, but it carried authority. The room fell silent, waiting for her to speak. We are facing a complex and significant case. Every step we take must be careful, and we must respect one another. I don't intend to revisit past mistakes, but I want to remind all of us that our work is for justice and for the people around us. That requires respect, not only for the law but also for those we work with," Mrs. Amara said, her eyes briefly resting on Jake. Jake felt a lump in his throat. Although she didn't directly criticize him, the gentleness and firmness in her words made him realize that she was teaching him a profound lesson about respect. She didn't need to speak harshly or reprimand him, but her meaningful words were enough to make him realize that this work wasn't just about enforcing the law or achieving success. It was about how we treat people, no matter who they are. Mrs. Amara continued, "Everyone has value and deserves respect, no matter who they are, where they come from, or what they do. Without mutual respect, we cannot work effectively and sustainably. I hope everyone will always remember that respect is the foundation of all relationships, whether in work or in life." Jake couldn't stop thinking about her words, especially when she looked at him again with a gaze that wasn't judgmental but filled with gentleness and understanding. He felt like a child being taught, but without shame. In fact, it was exactly what he needed, a reminder that would allow him to stand up and change. When the meeting ended and everyone began to leave, Jake stayed behind for a moment, lost in thought. He realized that what Mrs. Amara had said wasn't just advice for work, but a lesson for life. Respect wasn't just an outward action. It had to come from the heart. The regret and past mistakes suddenly became an opportunity for him to change, not only in his work, but in the way he treated everyone around him. Jake stood up and gently walked out of the meeting room. This time, he didn't feel ashamed or doubtful about himself anymore. He understood that he was ready to start anew. Jake sat alone in the break room, the soft light of the afternoon filtering through the window, casting long shadows on the scattered papers on the desk. The room was so silent that he could hear the steady beat of his own heart. He stared at the reports and documents before him, but his eyes couldn't focus on a single word. Everything in front of him seemed to blur, and in his mind, the only images that echoed were those of Mrs. Amara and her words from the meeting. Every time he thought about her, a wave of regret washed over him. He knew he needed to change, but it wasn't easy. His arrogance and ego, the things he had carried with him for years, now became the greatest obstacles on the path to his transformation. Thoughts about power, control, and always wanting to prove that he was strong and decisive kept swirling in his mind, making him feel as though he was struggling with himself. Whenever he thought about Mrs. Amara, about the calmness and authority she displayed, his heart tightened. He couldn't forget that gaze, not one of anger or resentment, but a gaze full of understanding, as if she had seen everything he had done, forgiven him, but was waiting for a real change from him. The shame he felt made him want to avoid her, but he couldn't erase that image from his mind. Mrs. Amara didn't need to criticize him with words. She only needed to remain silent and look at him. That in itself made him feel the weakness within himself. He started to realize that his oversized ego, his self-satisfaction, were the things that kept him from achieving true change. Every time he tried to move forward, thoughts of control and power would drag him back to his old ways. He wondered if he had the courage to let go of his ego, to learn to respect and understand others as Mrs. Amara had taught him. This internal struggle made it difficult for him to find peace. Waves of inner conflict continuously crashed against him, preventing him from breaking free from this contradiction. He wanted to change, to become a better person. But with each first step, he felt himself being pulled back by old habits. Each step forward was accompanied by a step backward, and that made him feel like he was trapped in a vicious cycle with no way out. Jake sat there asking himself if he was strong enough to overcome the barriers that had held him back for so long. Could he truly change, or was he just looking for ways to justify his past mistakes without actually making progress? These questions kept repeating in his mind, making him feel as though he was stuck in a battle he had to face on his own. Jake and Eleanor stood in the darkness outside the bar, their eyes tracking every movement of the suspects inside. They had been watching this group for an entire week, and this time things felt more tense than ever. The suspects seemed to be making a big deal, and Jake and Eleanor's mission was to capture every move to coordinate with other law enforcement agencies. Both were working under immense pressure, and every step had to be taken with great caution. Jake struggled to keep his focus on the task, but thoughts of his personal change kept swirling in his mind. He had decided to try to change, not only in his work, but also in how he communicated and treated others. He knew he couldn't continue to behave as he had in the past, judging and mocking people he encountered. Still, the lingering anxiety followed him because he wasn't sure if this change would happen quickly enough to truly become part of who he was. As the suspects began to leave the bar, Jake and Eleanor immediately followed. They had to ensure no attention was drawn toward them. Stepping into the bar, Jake noticed a woman standing near the door, seemingly just another regular customer. She was waiting for her friend. But what caught Jake's attention was how she looked at him. Normally, he would have felt uncomfortable, thinking people shouldn't focus on him. But this time, instead of feeling disturbed, Jake made an effort to stay calm and respectful. He gave her a slight smile, a gesture he would never have made before to strangers. She smiled back, and their eyes met for a brief moment. But that brief exchange made Jake feel a sense of relief. He felt a fleeting connection, a feeling he had never had before. He realized that instead of letting his arrogance control him, he could choose a calmer approach. And this realization made him feel better about himself. However, despite feeling a bit proud of his action, Jake couldn't shake the anxiety inside. He knew that such a small act wasn't enough to change himself completely. He wondered if he could maintain this change, or if, in just a few days, he would fall back into old habits. Would arrogance and ego completely fade, or would he again spiral into his old ways? As the suspects continued moving, Jake and Eleanor quickly followed them. But in that moment, Jake realized that the changes he was trying to make weren't big leaps. They were small but steady steps. The key was persistence. He couldn't expect everything to change instantly. Even though he felt anxious, at least he had taken one small step in this long journey, and that was something to be proud of. But the anxiety still lingered, like a shadow that would never leave him, reminding him that this change would take time and continuous effort. One afternoon, after finishing his work at the station, Jake received a call from Eleanor. "Mrs. Amara will be at the office for a meeting with us. Do you want to meet her?" Eleanor asked, his voice as calm as ever. Jake felt a mix of emotions. He hadn't seen Mrs. Amara since the court meeting, and although he had been trying to change himself, the anxiety and guilt over how he had treated her still clung to him. Jake stood up, took a deep breath, and decided that this time he wouldn't shy away. He wanted to face what he had done, no matter how difficult it might be. When he arrived at the office, Jake entered the meeting room and saw Mrs. Amara sitting there, looking toward the door with a sharp gaze, as if she had been waiting for him all along. In that moment, Jake's heart skipped a beat. He could feel her presence clearly, not just because of her power, but because of the calmness and strength she radiated. "Hello," Jake spoke, his voice hesitant, but Mrs. Amara's gaze made him feel an odd sense of calm. I truly want to apologize for what I did before. I can't believe I treated you like that. I judged you wrongly, and I feel so ashamed of the things I said." Mrs. Amara was silent for a moment, but there was no judgment or coldness in her eyes. Instead, she smiled gently, as though she had known that one day Jake would realize his mistake. "Jake," she began, her voice soft but firm. "Every one of us is capable of change, but it doesn't happen overnight. You must accept that change takes time and effort. The most important thing is that you truly want to change." Her words were like a refreshing breeze, soothing the tension in Jake's heart. He felt a sense of relief rising within him, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. Not only had she forgiven him, but she also believed that he could change. Her understanding and compassion made Jake feel that he was no longer alone in the internal struggle he had been facing. "Change isn't easy, Jake," she continued, her gaze never leaving him. "But if you persist, if you are truly ready to face your mistakes and learn from them, you will become the person you want to be. The important thing is not to give up and to believe in yourself." Jake felt a new sense of hope in his heart. Mrs. Amara's words were a powerful encouragement, pushing him to continue on the path he had started. He realized that not everything would be perfect immediately, but as long as he didn't stop trying, he would get there. The worries and fears about change no longer dominated him. He understood that even though the steps might be small and slow, as long as he kept moving forward, change would come. "We can't change everything in one day," Mrs. Amara smiled, as if reading his thoughts. "But every step, no matter how small, brings you closer to the person you want to be." Jake felt filled with gratitude. He looked at Mrs. Amara once more, and this time there was no shame or self-doubt, only respect and determination. "Thank you," he said, his voice now full of sincerity. I will try. I will do my best to change. Mrs. Amara nodded, saying nothing more. But the look she gave him was enough for Jake to feel that she had placed her trust in him. And that was the motivation he needed to continue the path ahead. Jake began a new phase in his life, one where he decided to try changing his behavior, not just in his work, but in how he interacted with everyone around him. Every morning, as he entered the police station, he made an effort to pay more attention to his colleagues. Instead of focusing only on his tasks and duties, he started to actively greet people he had previously ignored, even striking up conversations with those he had never noticed before. Whenever he heard a colleague share a small problem at work, or even in their personal life, Jake made an effort to listen rather than judge or criticize as he had done before. He reminded himself not to rush into making comments, but to take the time to understand others. One time, when a colleague of his faced a tough situation in a case, instead of simply directing him to follow orders, Jake paused, sighed, and asked, "Are you okay? Do you need any help?" That simple question made both of them feel a sense of relief. His colleague, who had often felt belittled, now felt respected, and that feeling also made Jake sense a small change within himself. With each such action, Jake felt a sense of lightness in his heart. He realized that change didn't have to be rushed, but rather it came through small steps. When he decided to listen to others without judging or mocking them, he felt he was becoming the person he wanted to be, not an arrogant cop, but someone who could empathize and understand the people around him. However, the self-doubt never left him. Each time he took a small but meaningful action, he worried about whether he could sustain this change long-term. Could he continue to evolve, or would he revert to his old habits? Even though he felt this change was right, his old ego still urged him forward like a shadow haunting every step. Jake began to ask himself, am I pretending to change because of an event, or is this a true step toward becoming someone new? These questions still circled in his mind, preventing him from fully relaxing. But he knew that every time he continued acting in a more positive way, he was gradually building a new version of himself. The self-doubt was inevitable, but it also became a motivation for him to push harder. One afternoon, while out overseeing traffic, a situation arose that in the past would have frustrated him and tested his patience. A driver had made a mistake and stopped right in the middle of the main road. Unlike before, when he would have criticized and immediately given orders, Jake walked up to the car and gently said, "Could you move your car, please? We're trying to keep the order." His calm yet firm words made the driver immediately understand and thank him before driving off. Jake felt a small sense of pride when he realized he had handled the situation in such a different way. He understood that respect and patience truly made things easier rather than creating tension and conflict. Though he still had moments of worry and self-doubt about his change, each small step like that made him feel like he was on the right path. And it was a small but important step toward creating real change within himself. In a crucial investigation into an international drug trafficking network, Jake and Eleanor were tasked with gathering information from an important informant. This was a high-stakes, risky situation where every decision could impact the investigation's progress and the lives of those involved. It was a situation where, in the past, Jake wouldn't have hesitated to use his authority and power to force suspects to talk. However, this time, Jake decided to approach things differently. The informant they needed to work with was a woman named Sarah, a member of the criminal network. Sarah wasn't easy to approach. She had witnessed the brutality and inhumanity of this organization, making it extremely difficult to convince her to cooperate with law enforcement. In previous investigations, Jake would have had no qualms about pressuring the suspect, making them feel threatened and forcing them to cooperate. But this time, he knew that using threats or pressure would only drive her further into silence, and they would lose the crucial opportunity to bring her into the cooperative process. Jake decided to try a different approach. He walked into the interrogation room, where Sarah was sitting across from him and Eleanor. She looked at them with a wary expression, as if every movement they made could be a threat. But Jake, instead of jumping in with tough questions or threats, sat down, maintained his distance, and began the conversation gently. "Sarah, I know you've been through a lot these past years," Jake began, his voice calm, with no trace of force or anger. "We're not here to hurt you. We just want to help you. We need you, but only when you feel ready." This wasn't a promise or a veiled threat. Jake simply expressed what he felt, and the sincerity in his voice broke through the defenses Sarah had built. She didn't respond immediately, but her gaze softened just a bit. Throughout the conversation, Jake patiently listened to what Sarah had to say, never interrupting, never rushing to conclusions. He just listened as she shared her fears, the relationships she had to maintain with the criminal organization, and what she had witnessed. Through each story, each word of hers, Jake gradually made Sarah feel his respect and understanding. He didn't see her as a criminal to be subdued, but as a person who had been pushed into difficult circumstances, just like many others he had encountered in his career. She began to open up more, no longer feeling threatened. That feeling wasn't one of fear, but of trust gradually taking form. Eventually, Sarah agreed to cooperate. She provided Jake and Eleanor with crucial information, helping them crack the case and arrest key members of the criminal network. The case was a success, and Jake felt a deep sense of satisfaction because he had been able to do his job not through power or coercion, but through patience and respect. As he left the interrogation room, Jake felt a sense of relief. He realized that sometimes change doesn't come from big decisions or violent actions. It comes from patience, from understanding and respecting others. This was a significant step for him, not just in his work, but in how he viewed and handled situations in life. The success of the case wasn't just a victory for the law. It was a victory for the change within Jake himself. He knew that while the path of change was still long, at least he had taken an important step on that journey. Jake stood alone in his room, gazing out the window at the glittering lights of Adama. It was late, but he couldn't take his eyes off the swirling thoughts in his mind. Today had been different. The successful investigation wasn't just about solving the case. It was about how he had worked, how he had treated those around him. He was no longer the same person, the arrogant cop who always used his power to dominate others. The small changes in his behavior had created significant impacts that he couldn't deny. He remembered the times before when he would never listen, would simply give orders and do things his way. He had become too accustomed to thinking of himself as the one in charge, the one who could judge others. But today, during his conversation with Sarah, he hadn't done that. He had listened, he had been patient, and he had respected her. And as a result, she had opened up, providing crucial information that helped take down a major criminal network. A sense of pride welled up inside Jake. He wasn't just satisfied with the success in his job, but also proud of the way he had changed. He realized that respect wasn't just a way to treat others. It was also about how we treat ourselves. Before, he hadn't known how to respect himself. He had let arrogance and ego blind him, not noticing the real values he needed to pursue. But now, he understood that self-respect was the foundation for respecting others. Jake felt a profound shift inside him. Each day, he felt more aware of the differences in how he viewed the world and the people around him. He no longer judged others based on appearances or differences. He had learned to see people with more understanding and compassion. His perception of himself had changed as well. He no longer felt ashamed of his past mistakes. Instead, he felt grateful for the lessons they had brought. Those mistakes had led him to maturity, to understanding that he could change, and more importantly, that he could help others change in a positive way. That was something he hadn't realized before. Jake smiled as he thought about the small steps he had taken. Every action, no matter how small, could have a huge impact. He felt proud of what he had done, not just for the successful case, but for the way he had lived and acted. He had begun to find peace within himself, and that made him feel stronger than ever. In his mind, Mrs. Amara's words echoed. Everyone can change, but it takes time and effort. Now, Jake knew he had begun walking the path she had shown him, the path of change and growth. Respect wasn't just an action toward others. It was also about how we treat ourselves. And he would never forget that. Jake had enjoyed a few months of quiet work since he began changing how he interacted with others. But then, a major challenge suddenly appeared in his work, testing all the values he had learned. A large transnational criminal organization had come under the radar of both the police and the FBI. And this time, it wasn't just the local police. It was necessary for all law enforcement agencies to work closely together to dismantle this network. But this wasn't going to be easy. The agencies had different working methods, priorities, and goals. Jake had worked with the FBI on major cases before, but this time he had to collaborate with many different forces, from federal agents to city police officers and even military units. Coordinating and ensuring that everyone was working in the same direction wasn't simple. Jake felt the pressure. knowing he had to connect and work effectively with people who might not fully understand the processes and principles he adhered to. After every meeting, Jake felt conflicted. The skeptical gazes from colleagues, the high demands from superiors, and the differences in working methods forced him to gradually learn to rein in his arrogance. He knew that if he couldn't maintain respect and cooperation, this case could fail. And failure wouldn't just be a personal disappointment. It could lead to the suffering of thousands of innocent people. Jake realized that even though he had changed how he treated others, facing this challenge meant he would have to retrain his patience and respect, not only for his colleagues, but for himself. He had to understand that no matter how careful he was, every action he took would affect the progress of the case. If he didn't control himself, everything could fall apart. When the next meeting took place, Jake walked into the room with a sense of nervousness. This time, Mrs. Amara was also present, along with agents and leaders from other agencies. The respect Jake had for her now wasn't just because she was the FBI director, but because she had helped him realize that respect and cooperation were key to success. Her presence in the room gave Jake a sense of reassurance, as if she were a symbol of leadership and decisiveness. Mrs. Amara didn't speak immediately. She listened to everyone present their plans. She observed and took careful notes, her sharp eyes never rushing to make judgments. When she finally spoke, everyone fell silent, listening intently to her words. "You are all experienced professionals, and I believe you can work effectively together. But what's most important is cooperation between agencies. If we don't respect each other's processes and ways of working, we won't be able to accomplish this mission." Her words were simple, but they gave Jake a new perspective. He knew she wasn't just talking about interagency coordination. She was speaking about the importance of respecting each individual's role. Those brief words of encouragement made him feel a renewed sense of hope that his personal change wasn't just something internal, but was also the right step for him to cooperate more effectively in this challenging working environment. Mrs. Amara continued, "Respect isn't just for others. It's also about how you view yourself and your colleagues. If you don't respect others, you won't create the cooperation necessary to reach our common goal." This time, her eyes rested on Jake, and he felt like he understood something deeply. Not only in work, but in life, respect and patience were the decisive factors in making things effective. Finally, after several weeks of tension, the case came to a conclusion. Thanks to the close cooperation and respect between agencies, the criminal network was completely dismantled. The people behind the major drug trafficking operation were arrested, and a vast amount of evidence was collected. It was a huge victory, not just for Jake and Eleanor, but for all the agencies involved. And in this victory, Jake felt a marked change within himself. He was no longer the arrogant and self-important person he once was. Every time he interacted with colleagues or other agencies, he had learned to listen and understand better. He no longer used power to impose himself on others, but instead relied on respect and collaboration. He realized that the change in how he treated people had played a huge role in the success of the case. Without mutual respect between the agencies, without cooperation, this case wouldn't have been completed. Jake stood at the end of the meeting, looking around at the people around him, feeling a deep sense of pride. He had changed, not only in his work, but in how he viewed everything around him. Every action he took had a significant impact on others, and he had learned that respect and patience were the keys to success. When Mrs. Amara smiled and patted him on the back, her eyes filled with encouragement, Jake knew he had done right. "Congratulations, Jake. This is just the first step of a long journey," she said. And with those words, Jake felt he had found the path he truly wanted to walk, the path of respect, cooperation, and real change. Jake had come a long way in his journey of self-change. He could hardly believe there had been times when he lived in arrogance, imposing his power on others, seeing himself as the center of every situation. But now, looking back, he felt that he had grown so much. The mistakes from his past no longer made him feel embarrassed or regretful as they once did. Instead, he felt grateful for the lessons life had taught him. The times he had faced mistakes, the difficult moments, and the criticisms were all essential parts of his growth. He knew that the path of change wasn't easy, but each time he looked back, he realized how far he had come. This feeling wasn't one of self-satisfaction, but a deep understanding of himself. He no longer saw himself as someone who was never wrong, but as someone who could learn, admit faults, and change. And that was what made him proud of himself. He hadn't just changed his actions, but he had also changed his perspective on life, on others, and most importantly, on himself. One afternoon, after an important court session, Jake received a call from Mrs. Amara. She said she would meet with him to discuss some work-related matters. But Jake sensed that this was also an opportunity for him to say thank you and once again apologize for his past mistakes. This meeting wasn't going to be an ordinary work meeting. For Jake, it was a special reunion, a chance to say the things he had been holding inside for so long. He stood in front of the meeting room door, his breath heavy, but there was no feeling of worry or fear. Everything seemed different now. When Mrs. Amara entered, her gaze was as sharp as ever, but there was no judgment or reproach. Instead, there was the calm and understanding that she always carried with her. Jake looked into her eyes and said, "Mrs. Amara, I know I was wrong before. I judged you. I disrespected you and what you represent. I deeply regret what I did, and I want to apologize once again." Mrs. Amara looked at Jake and smiled gently. "Jake, everyone can learn and change. What matters is having the courage to face our mistakes, and from there, we'll find the path to grow." Her voice was soft but firm, as if she had seen the change in him long ago. "I've seen the change in you, not just through words, but through your actions. That's what truly matters." Jake felt a sense of relief hearing those words. His heart felt calmer than it ever had. He knew that his change wasn't just about apologizing, but about truly learning and acting correctly. Mrs. Amara not only forgave him, but also trusted that he would become a better person, and that was what he needed most. When the meeting ended, Jake walked out of the room, no longer feeling the shame or guilt he once carried. He understood that the journey of regret and change never truly ends. Every day was an opportunity to become a better person, and he would never stop learning and improving. Jake was no longer the arrogant cop, someone who used power to impose himself on others. He had learned that respect and humility were important values, not just in work, but in all relationships. The small steps in this journey weren't always easy, but he understood that it was a continuous process that required patience. As Jake walked out of the courthouse, no longer filled with arrogance in his every step, he felt a real change within himself. He no longer felt that he was above others, but that he was part of a community where every action could affect those around him. Respect and humility had become an inseparable part of his life. And as he walked through the courthouse doors, it wasn't just the step of a cop. It was the step of a person who had matured, learned valuable lessons about life, and would continue to work and live with those values for the rest of his life. Life is a long and challenging journey, and sometimes we encounter twists and turns that leave us facing mistakes, failures, and disappointments. However, there is nothing more important than learning from those experiences, from the lessons we can learn from our difficulties and challenges. Here are some tips that can help you overcome life's challenges and become a better version of yourself. If you are inspired by stories with unexpected twists, moral challenges, and the impact of kindness, please support us by liking or subscribing to Emotional Journey. We put our heart and soul into each story, and it really means a lot to have you come along for the ride. Thank you for being a part of this journey.